The morning mist clung to the narrow pass like the breath of dying gods, and King Leonidas knew that death would come with the dawn. Standing at the threshold between Greece and annihilation, he watched the Persian scouts disappear into the rocky outcroppings of Thermopylae, their whispered reports already racing back to the god kings. The Hot Gates, that treacherous mountain pass where the sea kissed the cliffs, had become the last bastion between Greek freedom and Persian chains. The year was 480 before the Common Era, and the world had never seen an army like the one that now approached. Xerxes I, son of Darius, had assembled what chroniclers would later call the greatest military force ever assembled by mortal hands. From the golden halls of Persepolis to the windswept steppes of Scythia, from the sun-baked deserts of Egypt to the cedar forests of Lebanon, the Persian Empire had gathered its strength for this moment. The great king's host stretched across the horizon like a living sea of bronze and steel, their numbers so vast that they had drunk entire rivers dry and darkened the sky with their arrows. But here, at this god-forsaken pass where the mountains plunged into the Malian Gulf, geography had granted the Greeks a gift that no amount of Persian gold could buy, a battlefield where numbers meant nothing and courage meant everything. The pass was scarcely wide enough for a chariot, its northern wall a sheer cliff face that rose toward Mount Oda, its southern boundary the restless Aegean. Any army, no matter how numerous, could only attack in the narrowest of fronts. Leonidas had arrived 5 days earlier with his personal guard of 300 Spartiates, men who had proven their worth in the brutal training system that forged Spartan warriors from childhood. They were not alone, Thespians and Thebans, yet as the Persian advance guard crested the distant hills, their bronze armor glinting like scales on some primordial beast, Leonidas knew that numbers alone would not save them. The intelligence reports had been terrifying in their scope. According to sources cited by the World History Encyclopedia, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas and other Greek allies held back the Persians led by Xerxes I for 3 days but were defeated. The Persian force was estimated at anywhere from 100,000 to over 1 million men, though the true number would remain forever lost to history. What mattered was not the precise count but the overwhelming reality. They faced odds that would have broken lesser men before the first spear was thrown. Leonidas walked among his men as they prepared their weapons and checked their bronze-faced shields. These warriors bore the lambda, the Greek letter for Lacedaemon and Sparta's ancient name painted in crimson on their aspis. Each man had been born for this moment, raised on stories of glorious death and battle, taught that to return home with their shield or upon it was the highest honor a Spartan could achieve. Their crimson cloaks rippled in the sea breeze, and their bronze-tipped spears caught the dying light of the sun. The king paused beside Dinix, a grizzled veteran whose scars told stories of a dozen battles. The old warrior was methodically sharpening his sword, his weathered hand steadied despite the magnitude of what approached. "The Persians say their arrows will blot out the sun," Dinix remarked without looking up. "Good came his legendary reply, then we'll fight in the shade." As night fell over the Hot Gates, the first Persian campfires began to twinkle in the distance like fallen stars. The Greeks had chosen their ground well, but choosing ground and holding it were different matters entirely. Tomorrow would bring the first test, and Leonidas knew that everything, the independence of Athens, the freedom of Sparta, the very future of Greek civilization, hung in the balance. The die was cast, the trap was set, and the 300 would soon learn whether Spartan bronze could stand against Persian steel. In the morning, the god king would come for them, and the narrow pass would run red with the blood of heroes. The sun rose like a bloodshot eye over the Persian camp, illuminating a sight that would haunt the dreams of Greek survivors for generations. He had brought entire nations, the Immortals, the elite guard of 10,000, whose ranks were never allowed to diminish, stood in perfect formation, their scaled armor gleaming like serpent skin. Behind them stretched regiments of Medes and Assyrians, Bactrians and Indians, Egyptians and Phoenicians, each contingent bearing the arms and armor of their homeland. The great king himself sat upon a golden throne placed on a natural prominence overlooking the pass, his court arrayed around him like exotic birds. Xerxes was not merely a king but a god made flesh, heir to Cyrus the Great and Darius the Conqueror, ruler of an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Danube. His very presence was meant to overwhelm, to crush the spirit of resistance before the first arrow flew. Yet as his dark eyes fixed upon the narrow pass where the Greeks waited, he found not submission but defiance. The morning had begun with diplomacy, if it could be called that. Xerxes had sent his herald forward under a flag of truce, bearing an offer that had seemed generous to Persian ears. "Submit, lay down your arms, and be granted the privilege of serving in the great king's army." The response had been swift and uncomfortable. Leonidas had not even dignified the offer with words, instead gesturing toward the narrow pass where his men stood ready. The herald had returned with tallies of 300 warriors who showed no fear, who stood as motionless as bronze statues, their red cloaks snapping in the wind like battle standards. Then had come the demand that would echo through history. "Surrender your weapons," the herald had shouted across the pass. Leonidas had stepped forward, his bronze cuirass catching the morning light, and delivered his reply in the laconic style that had made Sparta famous, Molen Labe. The words carried across the pass like a thrown spear, and even the Persian soldiers within earshot understood their meaning. This would not be a negotiation. Xerxes had given the order with a gesture, and the first wave of his army had advanced. These were not his finest troops. The God King was to experience a general to waste his immortals on what should have been a simple matter of clearing Greek rebels from a mountain pass. Instead, he sent forward the Medes and Scythians, tough fighters who had served the Persian crown for generations. They advanced in good order, their wicker shields raised, their curved swords and long spears gleaming in the morning sun. The Greeks waited until the Persians were so close that they could see the individual designs on their shields. Then Leonidas had raised his spear, and the phalanx had moved forward like a bronze-tipped wave. The Spartan fighting formation was a thing of terrible beauty, overlapping shields creating an impenetrable wall, long spears projecting between them like the quills of some enormous hedgehog. Behind the front rank more spears reached forward, creating a bristling fence of bronze-tipped death. The collision was thunderous. Persian spears splintered against Spartan shields, while Greek bronze found the gaps in Eastern armor. The narrow pass became a charnel house as the front ranks ground against each other, neither side able to gain decisive advantage. But gradually, the superior armor and training of the Spartans began to tell. The Persian line wavered, then broke, survivors streaming back toward their own lines carrying tales of invincible Greek warriors who fought like demons. Xerxes sent in the second wave, then the third. Each time, the result was the same. The narrow pass negated the Persian advantage in numbers, forcing them to attack on a front no wider than the Greek formation could cover. The Spartans fought with mechanical precision, their bronze-tipped spears finding gaps in enemy armor, their shields deflecting arrows and sword strokes with equal ease. Behind them, the Thespians and Thebans held the wider part of the pass, ensuring that no Persian could outflank the main Greek line. By midday, the ground before the Greek position was carpeted with Persian dead. The survivors who stumbled back to their lines brought reports that must have seemed impossible to their commanders. A handful of Greeks was holding back the entire Persian army. The God King's wrath was a terrible thing to behold, and his generals knew that excuses would not be tolerated. Fresh troops were brought forward, different tactics attempted, but the results remained the same. The hot gates had become a killing ground, and the Greeks held the key. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this would be no simple conquest. The 300 had drawn Persian blood, and the taste of it was sweet. But Xerxes was not a man to be denied, and his army was vast beyond counting. The first day belonged to the Greeks, but the night would bring counsel, and with it, new strategies. The God King would not be turned back by a handful of Greek spearmen, no matter how skilled. The real test was yet to come. The second day dawned with the sound of 10,000 shields being beaten in unison, a thunderous rhythm that rolled across the pass like the drumbeat of approaching doom. Xerxes had spent the night in council with his generals, and the result of their deliberations now approached the Greek lines with methodical precision. The great king had finally decided to unleash his most feared warriors, the Immortals, the elite guard who had never known defeat. These were not the conscripts and levies who had tested the Greek defenses the day before. The Immortals were the pride of the Persian army, drawn from the noble houses of the empire and trained from childhood in the arts of war. Their name came from their number, which was kept at exactly 10,000. When one fell, another immediately took his place, making the unit truly deathless. They advanced in perfect formation, their scale armor gleaming like fish scales in the morning sun, their long spears held with practiced ease. At their head rode Hydarnes, the greatest general in the Persian army after Xerxes himself. He had never failed his king, never retreated from a battlefield, never known the taste of defeat. His dark eyes surveyed the Greek position with professional interest, noting the slight gaps in their formation, the way their shields overlapped, the positioning of their reserve troops. He had broken phalanxes before, had scattered Greek armies from the Hellespont to the Aegean. These 300 would be no different. But as the Immortals drew closer, something unexpected happened. The Greeks began to retreat. The bronze-faced shields that had stood like a wall the day before suddenly gave ground, the crimson cloaks of the Spartans disappearing behind the rocky outcroppings of the pass. Hydarnes smiled grimly. Finally, the Greeks were showing sense. Fear had accomplished what Persian steel could not. The retreat continued, the Greeks falling back in apparent disorder. The Immortals pressed forward, their discipline holding even as the scent of victory filled their nostrils. This was how battles were won, not in the first clash of arms, but in the moment when one side's nerve finally broke. The narrow pass widened slightly as they advanced, offering more room for the Persian formation to deploy. Then, with shocking suddenness, the Greeks turned. What had seemed like a rout revealed itself as a perfectly executed tactical withdrawal. The Spartans had drawn the Immortals into a slightly wider section of the pass, where their formation could be more easily outflanked. Now, with a coordination that spoke of countless hours of drill, the 300 wheeled and charged. The collision was catastrophic. The Immortals, expecting to strike fleeing enemies in the back, instead found themselves facing a wall of bronze and crimson fury. Spartan spears, longer and heavier than their Persian counterparts, punched through scale armor as if it were made of cloth. The famous Greek war cry echoed off the cliff walls, multiplied and amplified, until it seemed as if the mountains themselves were screaming. Leonidas fought in the front rank, his bronze-tipped spear dancing like a thing alive. To his right, Denix had discarded his broken spear and drawn his sword, the curved blade rising and falling in mechanical precision. All around them, the Spartans fought with the cold efficiency that had made them the terror of the Peloponnese. They gave no quarter and asked for none, their bronze armor splattered with Persian blood, their red cloaks torn in battle. The Immortals, despite their elite status, found themselves pressed back, step by bloody step. Their superior numbers meant nothing in the narrow confines of the pass, where only the front rank could engage. Behind them, their comrades could do nothing but watch as the Greeks methodically cut down their companions. The vaunted discipline of the Persian guard began to crack under the relentless pressure. Hydarnes himself led a desperate charge, his curved sword flashing as he sought to break the Greek line through sheer audacity. He nearly succeeded, his blade finding a gap in Spartan armor and drawing blood, but the phalanx held, and the general found himself isolated, surrounded by bronze-pointed spears. His death was swift and without ceremony, a thrust through the throat that ended the career of one of Persia's greatest warriors. With their commander fallen, the Immortals' morale finally shattered. They began to fall back, first slowly, then with increasing haste. The retreat became a rout as the Greeks pressed forward, their battle cry echoing off the cliff walls. Persian borders littered the pass like autumn leaves, and the survivors who made it back to their lines carried tales that would have seemed impossible just days before. From his golden throne, Xerxes watched his elite guard flee in disorder, and for the first time since beginning his invasion of Greece, the god king felt the cold touch of doubt. The Immortals had never been defeated, never retreated from any battlefield. Yet here they were, streaming back from the pass like beaten dogs, their precious discipline shattered by a handful of Greek spearmen. The second day belonged to the Greeks, but the cost was becoming apparent. Several Spartans had fallen, their bronze armor cracked and bloodied, their red cloaks now serving as burial shrines. The 300 were no longer 300, and each loss was felt keenly in the tight confines of the pass. Yet still they stood defiant against the might of the Persian Empire. As night fell over the hot gates, both sides knew that the decisive moment was approaching. The Greeks had proven that they could not be taken by direct assault, but Xerxes was not a man to be denied. Somewhere in the darkness, plans were being made that would change the course of the battle, and of history itself. The third dawn broke with an ominous silence that settled over the pass like a funeral shroud. The Persian campfires still burned in the distance, but something had changed in the night. The usual sounds of an army preparing for battle, the clash of bronze on bronze, the shouted orders of officers, the nervous laughter of soldiers, were notably absent. Instead, an eerie quiet had descended, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocky defiles and the distant crash of waves against the shore. Leonidas stood at the edge of the Greek position, his weathered face creased with concern. His scouts had reported movement in the darkness, not the massed advance of another frontal assault, but something more subtle and infinitely more dangerous. Persian cavalry had been seen moving east along the coast road, their torches flickering like fireflies in the pre-dawn gloom. The Spartan king knew what this meant, though he had prayed it would not come to pass. The betrayal had begun the previous evening, when a figure had slipped from the Greek lines under cover of darkness. Ephialtes of Moles, a local Greek whose knowledge of the mountain paths was without equal, had met his way to the Persian camp with an offer that would change the course of history. In exchange for gold and the promise of favor under Persian rule, he would guide Hydarnes' successor and a picked force of Immortals along the Anapeia path, a narrow goat track that wound through the mountains and emerged behind the Greek position. The path was treacherous, barely wide enough for a single file of men, winding through rocky defiles and across precipitous slopes where a single misstep meant death. It was known only to the local inhabitants, the shepherds and hunters, who had used it for generations to move their flocks between the mountain pastures. No army had ever attempted to traverse it, and for good reason. It was a route for goats and desperate men, not for organized military units. But Ephialtes knew every stone, every treacherous turn, every place where the path narrowed to mere inches. He had been born in these mountains, had run these trails as a child, had used them to escape Persian raiders in the early days of the invasion. Now, driven by greed and the promise of reward, he led the enemies of Greece along paths that should have remained secret until the end of time. The Phocians who had been stationed to guard the mountain paths had been overwhelmed in the darkness, their desperate warning cries echoing off the cliff walls before being cut short by Persian blades. A few survivors had escaped to carry word to Leonidas, but by then it was too late. The trap that had served the Greeks so well was about to become their tomb. As the sun climbed higher, the first Persian scouts appeared on the heights above the pass. They moved carefully, testing each foothold, but their presence was unmistakable. The Immortals were coming, and when they arrived, the Greeks would be caught between two forces, the main Persian army to the front and the elite guard to the rear. The narrow pass that had been their salvation would become their grave. Leonidas gathered his remaining officers for a final council of war. The faces around him were grim but determined. These were men who had always known that death in battle was preferable to life in shame. The Thespians and Thebans were dismissed, ordered to withdraw while they still could. Some obeyed, streaming south toward Athens and safety. Others, led by the noble Demophilus, chose to remain and share the fate of their Spartan allies. "We could withdraw," suggested Alphaeus, one of the younger officers. "Fall back to the next defensible position. Make them fight for every mile of Greek soil." But even as he spoke, they all knew it was impossible. The Persian cavalry was already moving south, and any retreat would become a rout. Besides, this was Thermopylae, the hot gates where heroes were made and legends born. This was where they would make their stand. The morning wore on with skirmishes and probing attacks as the main Persian force tested the Greek defenses. But these were half-hearted efforts, designed more to keep the Greeks occupied than to achieve any decisive result. Xerxes was waiting for word from the mountains, waiting for the moment when his enemies would be trapped between hammer and anvil. That moment came shortly after noon, when the war cries of the Immortals echoed from the heights behind the Greek position. The flanking force had arrived, and with them came the end of all hope. The 300, now fewer than 200 after 2 days of brutal fighting, found themselves surrounded, cut off from retreat, facing death from all sides. But if this was to be their end, it would be an ending worthy of Sparta. Leonidas raised his spear one final time, and his voice carried across the pass with the authority of a man who had never known defeat. "Breakfast well, my friends," he called out, his words echoing off the cliff walls. "Tonight we dine in Hades." The response was immediate and thunderous. The war cry of the Spartans rose like the roar of an avalanche, defiant and proud and utterly without fear. The final act of the tragedy was about to begin, and the mountains themselves would bear witness to how free men died when their backs were to the wall and their honor was at stake. The hot gates had become a cauldron of death, and the 300 would write their names in blood and bronze for all eternity. The final assault came like a storm breaking over the mountains, terrible in its fury and inexorable in its approach. From the heights above, the flanking force of Immortals descended like bronze-clad avalanche, their scaled armor glinting in the afternoon sun. From the narrow mouth of the pass, the main Persian army advanced in overwhelming numbers, their ranks so deep that the rear formations were lost in the dust and haze of their own movement. Caught between these two forces, the remnants of the Greek army faced annihilation. The Thespians who had chosen to remain fought with desperate courage, their bronze-tipped spears finding Persian flesh, even as enemy arrows darkened the sky above them. The Thebans, led by the noble Leon, formed a final phalanx that held for precious minutes before being overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers. But it was the Spartans who provided the day's most magnificent and terrible spectacle. Reduced now to fewer than 100 men, they fought with a mechanical precision that had made them the terror of the Peloponnesus. Their bronze armor was dented and bloodstained, their red cloaks torn and mud-spattered, but their discipline remained unbroken. They formed a final circle around their king, their shields locked together, their spears projecting outward like the quills of some enormous hedgehog. Leonidas stood at the center of the formation, his royal armor gleaming despite the carnage around him. His bronze cuirass bore the scars of a dozen near misses, and his shield was pierced by arrows that had somehow found their way through the wall of bronze. Yet he stood erect, his spear steady in his hand, his voice carrying clearly across the din of battle as he encouraged his men in their final hour. The Persian archers, positioned on the heights above, poured volleys of arrows into the Greek formation. The sky was black with shafts, so many that they seemed to blot out the sun itself. The Spartans raised their shields overhead, creating a bronze canopy that rang like a bell tower under the rain of arrows. Many shafts found their mark, punching through bronze armor or finding gaps in the defensive formation. One by one, the red cloaks fell, until the circle grew smaller and smaller. Denix, the grizzled veteran who had joked about fighting in the shade, took an arrow through the throat but continued to fight, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, until his strength finally gave out. Young Alphaeus, barely 20 years old, fell with a Persian spear through his chest, but managed to take his killer with him as he died. All around the circle, heroes whose names would be remembered for 3,000 years wrote their final chapters in blood and bronze. The end came swiftly when the Persian infantry finally closed with the Greek formation. The Immortals, supported by picked troops from across the empire, surged forward in a final assault that no mortal force could withstand. The bronze circle contracted, then shattered, as individual Spartans found themselves cut off and surrounded. They fought to the last, going down under multiple sword strokes, their war cries echoing off the cliff walls until the very stones seemed to weep. Leonidas fell with a dozen wounds, his body pierced by Persian spears and arrows. Even in death, he maintained his kingly bearing, his face set in the stern expression that had intimidated enemies and allies alike. Around him the last of the 300 died as they had lived, with honor intact and courage undimmed. The hot gates ran red with their blood, and the narrow pass was carpeted with the bodies of the bravest men who had ever drawn breath. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the distant crash of waves against the shore. The Persians themselves seemed awed by what they had witnessed, moving carefully among the Greek dead as if fearful of disturbing the sleep of heroes. Even Xerxes, when he finally descended from his golden throne to survey the battlefield, spoke in whispers as he gazed upon the carnage. The great king had ordered that Leonidas be beheaded and his body crucified, a fate reserved for the worst criminals and rebels, but even his own soldiers seemed reluctant to carry out the order, and it was done quietly, without ceremony, as if the Persians themselves were ashamed of the necessity. The head of the Spartan king was displayed on a spear, but there was no celebration, no triumph in the act. The cost of victory had been too high, the enemy too noble in their defeat. As the sun set over the hot gates on that third day of battle, the Persian army began its march southward toward Athens. They had won the battle, but at a price that would haunt them for the remainder of the campaign. The 300 were dead, but their sacrifice had bought time for the Greek city-states to prepare their defenses. More importantly, they had shown the world that the Persian Empire, vast and mighty though it was not invincible. The narrow pass fell silent as darkness claimed the battlefield, but the echoes of what had happened there would resonate through the ages. The hot gates had become a shrine to courage, a testament to the truth that some things are worth dying for. The 300 had found their bitter end, but in dying, they had achieved a kind of immortality that no earthly king could ever claim. The morning after the battle dawned gray and still, as if the very sky mourned the heroes who lay silent in the pass. The Persian army had moved on, leaving behind only the dead and the memories of what had transpired in those narrow defiles. But even as Xerxes marched south toward Athens, the news of Thermopylae raced ahead of him, carried by swift runners and refugees who had witnessed the final stand of the 300. In Athens the assembly fell silent as the messenger delivered his report. The flower of Sparta was dead, King Leonidas had fallen, and the hot gates had been lost. Yet strangely, the mood in the city was not one of despair, but of grim determination. The 300 had died, but they had died well, buying precious time for the city-states to prepare their defenses. Their sacrifice had shown that Persian blood could be spilled, that the god-king's armies could be made to pay dearly for every mile of Greek soil. The news spread like wildfire throughout the Greek world. In Corinth and Megara and Aegina and Argos, men gathered in the marketplaces to hear the tale repeated. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the essential truth remained unchanged. 300 Spartans had held the pass against impossible odds, dying to the last man rather than yield an inch of ground. Their names were repeated like a litany of heroes: Leonidas and Dynax, Alpheus and Procles, men who had chosen death before dishonor. But perhaps the most significant impact of the battle was felt in Sparta itself. When the news reached the city, the ephors, the 5 elected magistrates who governed alongside the kings, received it with the stoic dignity for which their people were famous. There was no wailing, no tearing of clothes, no public displays of grief. Instead, the mothers and wives of the fallen met the news with pride, knowing that their sons and husbands had upheld the ancient laws of The most famous response came from Gorgo, the widow of Leon. When a Persian messenger arrived at the city gates with news of her husband's death, she received him with regal composure. "Your husband died well," the messenger said, perhaps expecting tears or pleas for mercy. Gorgo's reply would be remembered for centuries, as was fitting for a Spartan king, and as I expected of him. Her words captured the essence of Spartan culture, the belief that death in battle was not a tragedy but a fulfillment, the culmination of a life lived according to the warrior code. The strategic consequences of Thermopylae were profound. Although the Persians had won the battle, their losses had been enormous. Estimates vary, but it is likely that Xerxes lost between 10 and 20,000 men in the 3 days of fighting, a significant portion of his elite troops. More importantly, the delay had allowed the Greek fleet to prepare for the naval battle at Salamis, where the combined forces of Athens and Sparta would deal the Persian navy a crushing defeat. The moral impact was even greater. The Greek city-states, which had seemed on the verge of submission, found new resolve in the sacrifice of the 300. The men who had died at Thermopylae became symbols of resistance, proof that even the mightiest empire could be opposed. Their example inspired the Greeks at Salamis, at Plataea, and in all the battles that followed. The Persian invasion, which had seemed unstoppable, began to falter as Greek resistance hardened. In the years that followed, the site of the battle became a place of pilgrimage. Travelers would journey to the hot gates to see where the 300 had made their stand, to walk the ground where heroes had fallen. Poets and historians would tell and retell the story, each adding their own embellishments but never losing sight of the central truth, that a small band of men had chosen to die rather than retreat, and in doing so had changed the course of history. The epitaph that was eventually carved on the memorial stone at Thermopylae captured the essence of their sacrifice. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The words were simple, unadorned, but they carried within them the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. These men had died not for personal glory or material gain, but in service to an ideal, the belief that freedom was worth any price, that honor was more precious than life itself. Centuries later, when the Roman Empire ruled the Mediterranean world, generals would still invoke the memory of Thermopylae before going into battle. The story of the 300 became part of the fabric of Western civilization, a reminder that courage and sacrifice could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. From the Renaissance to the American Revolution, from the beaches of Normandy to the mountains of Afghanistan, soldiers would remember the Spartans who held the pass and find strength in their example. The Hot Gates had claimed the lives of 300 men, but in return they had given the world a story that would never die. The bitter end of the 300 had become the beginning of a legend that would inspire warriors and poets, kings and commoners, for as long as men valued courage over comfort and honor over life. In the narrow pass where they fell, Leonidas and his men had achieved the only immortality that truly matters. They had become eternal in the memory of mankind. Their sacrifice echoes still, a reminder that some things are worth dying for, and that the price of freedom is always paid in blood. The 300 had found their bitter end, but in dying, they had won a victory that no earthly conqueror could ever claim. The Hot Gates had become their tomb, but also their monument, a testament to the truth that heroes never truly die. They simply march on into legend, their courage lighting the way for all who come after.